And okay. I'm clicking on, got it. There we go. So again, I'm Susan Oxley. It's great to be with you. And we will begin exploring the theme of Grow Peace here as it relates to climate crisis and the climate emergencies that we're dealing with. By looking first at our Christian tradition, the Christian world back 2,000 years ago, right after Jesus was arrested, let's look at Peter's denial of Christ. Remember that it took place in the courtyard of the high priest, where he was waiting out to find out how things were going to go with the trial. And I'm reading now from Mark 14, 72, of Peter's denial of Christ. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him. She said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again, he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and cried. So just think a moment about what it is that motivated Peter to deny that he knew Christ. You can unmute yourselves and just kind of chip in your answers. What is it that motivated Peter's denial? What do you think?
I think
Fear.
Okay, fear, yes. Fear of what?
Fear of being attacked, fear of experiencing what Jesus was going through, fear of not knowing what the crowd would do if he'd said, "No, I am with Jesus," what would happen?
Okay, yeah, he was definitely in the minority in that group, wasn't he?
Yep.
Okay. All right, what else might have motivated him? I think fear is a very prominent motivator, but what else might have motivated him? Anybody?
Wanted to stay there. He didn't want to be removed.
Okay, a desire to stay right where he was and not be arrested and removed. He wanted to find out what was going on with Jesus. Good.
I wonder if something to do with surprise, like he hadn't processed what had really happened. He certainly wasn't processing what the crowd was. Jesus had already warned him what was going to happen, and he had sort of tunnel vision in the experience. And so just because maybe his first reaction every time was to say no, and he just followed with his normal pattern because he hadn't thought it through.
Sure. So he and all the other disciples were probably in shock, trying to process this, trying to figure out what in the world is going on, had no clue. Although Jesus had tried to prepare them, he really was not prepared, especially for what was going to come. And it may be at that point he was also feeling a sense of hopelessness, an inability to help, although he wanted to, and And where's the hope in all this? Where are we going? So I want you to listen now to another scripture. I want you to listen to the scripture in Acts that happens just a few weeks later at the time of Pentecost. I want you to listen and hear what was going on at that time and think as I read this about the change. What has changed to enable Peter and the other apostles to be such strong witnesses for Christ? I'm reading from Acts 2, 14, 32, 33, and 36. I'm skipping over a lot of his sermon. Get to the heart of it, okay? Where's 14? Find my place. Here we go. But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and listen to what I say. And he rehearses some history of the Jews. Finally, he gets to the point where he says, this Jesus God raised up, and of all that, all of us are witnesses. Being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out this that you both see and hear. Therefore, let the entire house of Israel know with certainty that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus, the crucified. So, from denying Christ, he bore a strong witness to Christ. What had changed?
The resurrection.
There were a lot of factors, and but there's one I'd like to just mention. One of the reasons I think he denied Christ was because he was suddenly leaderless. That for 3 years he'd been a follower, doing as Jesus taught him to do and told him to do, and all of a sudden there's no direction. There's no leader with the plan to get us out of this. And I think that that's a key part, is having the surety of knowing what the plan is and how I'm supposed to act. And so between then, with the experience of Jesus coming after his resurrection to the disciples and instructing them, that gave him more a sense of purpose. He wasn't floundering. And I know that's a long way to say that, but I just thought that was one aspect.
Sure. So that changed for them. They suddenly had found not only a purpose, but also a leader. And how did that happen? What was it that happened to give them that sense of purpose and leadership?
The resurrection.
Resurrection, the risen Christ. Yeah. What else happened?
And the preparation between the crucifixion and shortly after, until Pentecost. After
Yep.
Jesus said, go and wait. And while they were waiting, they studied and prayed.
And Jesus was, the scriptures say, was around for 40 days to instruct and prepare them.
Yep.
To give them guidance. Okay, so a lot of knowledge, a lot of preparation, a lot of study, gaining expertise. And then what happened at Pentecost?
Endowed with the Spirit.
Endowed with the Spirit. And so the Holy Spirit prompted that courage and witness, as well as all of the leadership and preparation, and I think probably a growing hope, right? As they gain purpose and preparation. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Well, Peter knew now. It wasn't just faith. It wasn't just something Jesus told him. He experienced Jesus several times during those 40 days. And then the presence of the Spirit was confirmation. So he had much more power within him. And I think that's part of what propelled him.
I think that's a good answer too. Certainty. Confirmation that all that had brought him to this point was true and good and trustworthy. Okay, let's go ahead and view this TED Talk, this video of a professor from the University of Utah who talks about our denial of climate change. We're going to move now from Peter's denial to denial of climate change. He gives a lot of background, and you may know all of that. That's a good summary of where we are today with the science. Note that the types of denial that he mentions and his suggestions for moving beyond denial to action. I want to warn you about one thing. He labels these different types of deniers, and one of the labels he uses is bonehead deniers. Our enduring principles, all the values that we stand for, impel us to not label people in a pejorative manner. And so I want to warn you about that label, bonehead deniers, that it's there. He uses it to refer to those who doubt the scientific background behind climate change. So we're going to change that in our PowerPoint presentation and in our conversation. We aren't going to label anybody bonehead deniers, okay? Because they could easily label me a bonehead scientist or something. I mean, it can go either way. So I just want to warn you about that phrase and say that we are going to change that. Okay. But otherwise, it's a good video. Let's watch it.
While I was working on my PhD back in 2005, I had the opportunity to pick up a guest speaker from the airport. Dr. Steven Schneider. He was the lead author on the most comprehensive report on climate change to be written up to that time. So he gave me a little bit of trouble for picking him up in a single occupancy SUV. I probably should have seen that one coming, I guess. And I knew he was right, but I rationalized it by telling myself, I'm just one person. This is a big systemic problem that we have to fix. But he gave a phenomenal talk. It really changed the arc of my career. Up to that point, I'd just been studying earth sciences. And he convinced me that to solve society's most pressing problems, we have to be studying human and natural systems as integrated parts of a whole. I've been working towards that ever since. I remember the day, about 5 years later, reading that he had abruptly passed away. He had a pulmonary embolism on an airplane. And I was devastated, but I was also just struck by the profound irony that someone who dedicated his life to climate activism died doing one of the most fossil fuel intensive activities any human can do, flying. But that's just how we all thought at that point. You had to fly for research, you had to fly for meetings, you had to fly for conferences. The more successful you were, the more flying you did. And it's only recently, as I've been reflecting on my own career and the amount of travel I've done as a scientist, that I've stopped and wondered, have I been living the life of a climate change denier? You ever have a moment like that where you're just gobsmacked by this realization that your behavior and your beliefs are just not as well aligned as you thought they were? Well, fast forward to 2015. President Obama was making climate a priority. The US was actively shaping the Paris Agreement. There were reasons for optimism. By 2015, we had known everything we needed to know for decades, and actually much longer than that. The first paper to describe the global warming problem was published in 1856. 1856. By an American scientist, Eunice Foote. She laid it all out, all the way back then. And certainly Al Gore updated and reminded us in gory detail in the mid-1990s. By 2015, we were swimming in oceans of data from meteorological stations all around the world. We'd collected thousands of sediment cores from lakes and ice cores from glaciers that allow us to reconstruct what past climates have been like. And they were all telling us how far outside of normal conditions we were. This is no natural cycle. We're way outside of natural conditions. We had little gadgets we could use to measure CO2 coming out of individual leaves on trees, as well as at the scale of entire cities and whole continents. And all of this information was feeding into some of the most sophisticated computer models ever created to help us predict what future climate scenarios look like. And yet, despite this mountain of information that was all pointing in the same direction and screaming at us of what a disaster we had created, in February of 2015, Jim Inhofe brought a snowball onto the floor of the US Senate as evidence that climate change was just a hoax. He brought a snowball. This was his attempt to undermine a century and a half of science. This was his response to the recent observation that 2014 had been the hottest year on record. Well, guess what? 2015 was even hotter, as was 2016 and 2017 and 2018 and 2019 and 2020. They were all hotter. Inhofe was the definition of a climate change denier at that time. Some called these people skeptics. I don't think so. Skeptics bring substantive arguments to debate. Inhofe and the other deniers responded to all the overwhelming science by just saying, nah. And it worked. It was enough to continue to delay action. And we as a society, we just let that go. We let that go. So let's just briefly talk about our current situation. I'm sure many of you know the story. Fossil fuels continue to rise. This plot shows global energy consumption from all these different sources over the past 200 years. We've seen huge increases in fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, just since the year 2000. If you look around and you see solar panels going up and wind farms and you feel like we've got this problem licked, I got to burst that bubble for you right now. All global renewables are represented in that thin green band there. Renewables have not offset fossil fuels in any way, shape, or form. They've only enabled growth in energy consumption. I think it's important to point out here, too, that the vast majority of these historical fossil fuel emissions were put in the air by white people, mostly in Europe and North America. And people of color are impacted disproportionately by climate change all around the world. So I don't see how we can look at this as anything other than a form of environmental racism, whether it was intentional or not. Just what does a hotter future look like? We're already starting to see hints of the severe implications to come, and we're becoming a little bit desensitized to it. More extreme weather, more floods, more droughts, more wildfire, more food and water shortages. All of these cause political, social, and economic instabilities. So we're expecting tens to hundreds of millions of climate refugees by 2050. Human suffering. Ecosystems failing. Instabilities that pose threats to national security for which we are precariously unprepared, according to the US military. We are in a climate emergency, and I'm using that word emergency very precisely to mean a threat that requires immediate action to avoid catastrophic outcomes. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking, but I've got 5 other emergencies going on right now. But climate change is the big one because it multiplies all of these other problems. Mental health, infectious disease, poverty, they're all multiplied, they're amplified by climate change. And so many of the impacts of climate change are irreversible. What happens from here is up to us. Every bit of fossil carbon we put in the air makes it worse and more expensive to deal with. We're out of wiggle room. We're out of time for delays and half measures. The next 5 years are critical. We must start to dramatically reduce fossil fuels starting now. So this all begs the question, what is a climate change denier in the 2020s? We still have some of these bonehead deniers, that just overtly refuse to accept facts. There's no amount of information that's going to convince them. Maybe it's a defense mechanism for them. They can't handle the truth. Maybe they have a financial or political stake in our current fossil fuel economy. All we know for sure is that they're wrong and in denial of reality. Most people choose to accept facts. 60 to 70% of Americans understand climate change is happening. They're concerned about it. They believe it will harm future generations, and they think we should be taking action now. But even among these people, these good, well-intentioned people, there are still so many passive forms of climate change denial. Take, for example, what I call the VIP denier. These are very important people. Anything they do is so important that the carbon pollution they produce is justified in their opinion. This was me 5 years ago. This is why I thought it was okay to fly around the world and tell people about how bad climate change was, right? But here's the thing. We have a small, fixed, and non-negotiable amount of carbon we can put in the air before we reach critical climate thresholds. And the air doesn't care who burns it. So if I burn a bunch of fossil fuels on a flight across the country for a 2-day conference, that's fossil fuels that someone in India can't use to feed their entire family for a full year. A full year. We can all rationalize that what we do is important, but when we have a fixed amount of carbon we can put in the air, equity matters. There's also the technologist denier. Some of them will say, well, I can burn as much fossil fuels as I want. The next generation is going to solve it. Number one, we don't have that kind of time. Number two, that's our kids. That's our grandkids we're talking about. Haven't we put enough on them already? Wouldn't we rather leave them with a better world rather than bigger problems to deal with? Other technologist deniers will say, well, there's a big breakthrough right around the corner. It's going to solve all of this. All these problems are just going to go poof. Yeah, right. Anyone driving a hydrogen-powered car or have a carbon capture tower in your backyard? No. We've been talking about those technologies for decades, and they're still impractical. There will be technological advances, but we are terrible at predicting when they're going to be ready for use at scale. Reducing emissions right now buys us time for those technologies to come to fruition. There's also the offset denier. So they think, I can burn as much fossil fuels as I want now. I'm just going to pay somebody $10 to plant a tree and hope it doesn't burn down. Now, don't get me wrong here. Planting trees is great. But number one, the carbon offset accounting at the global scale is pretty unreliable. Number two, more importantly, we simply cannot offset all the fossil carbon we're taking out of the ground by putting trees on Earth's surface. We literally run out of viable tree habitat pretty quickly. And third, once we bring all that fossil carbon up and put it on the surface, we have to manage it. And we all know that carbon can be locked up in a tree 1 minute and go up in smoke and be back in the air the next. The only way to keep the carbon out of the air is to keep the fossil fuels in the ground. So plant trees. I love trees. But don't use it as an excuse to burn a bunch more fossil fuels. In many ways, I feel like these offset schemes are more effective at offsetting guilt than they are at offsetting anything to do with our carbon fossil fuel pollution. Lastly, we've got the helpless bystander denier. Totally accepts the science, totally can't do anything about it. Climate change is a problem that somebody else needs to solve. In some ways, this may be the worst form of denial because it exudes inactivism, and inactivism is contagious. At this point in history, if you're just standing around doing nothing on this, you are part of the problem. See, in the 2020s, it's not just about denying the science. The much more common problem now is in denying that it's an emergency. It's about denying our own power to play a real role in actionable, I can get it done today solutions. So let me try to redefine what it is to be a climate change denier in the 2020s. I think a climate change denier at this point is anyone that has a large carbon footprint and is not working every day to reduce fossil fuel use. If you're wondering if you have a large carbon footprint, if you drove here today or you're watching this on a computer or you fly a couple times a year, you definitely have a large carbon footprint. Welcome to the club. Now, you can't solve it all yourself. We have a massive global system that needs to be fixed. But we have to work on it together, and we must work on it every day. So let's finish up by talking about what it means to work on it every day. So many things you can do cost nothing. Vote for science, vote for clean energy, vote for an economy in which everyone pays for what they get. Another thing we can just do is just talk about it. We need to normalize talking about climate change. Talk about our concerns, talk about solutions, speak up to those spreading misinformation. You know, we can only vote every couple of years when an election rolls around, but we can call our representatives every day, and sometimes I do. Especially the local ones that are most likely to listen. A third thing we can do is just don't buy so much stuff, right? Think of how much money I just saved you. When we're embedded in a fossil fuel intensive system, buying less stuff saves a lot of fossil fuel pollution. And when you have to buy stuff, buy from truly sustainable companies. Don't fall for the false promises and half measures. If a company says they're getting rid of plastic bags, that's great. Give them a high five. Should have done it 20 years ago. Keep going. You've only solved about 1% of the problem, right? We need the whole system to be fossil fuel free. I'm not going to go through the laundry list of things we can each do to eliminate fossil fuels. There are lots of other great TED Talks and other resources out there about climate action. This is a talk about recognizing the passive forms of climate change denial. I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to motivate you to become part of the solution every day. There's an active role for everyone to play, whether you're a chef or a server, a janitor, a teacher, a business owner, a healthcare worker, a truck driver, an artist. Whether you're unemployed or retired, there's a role for you. Whatever your talents, your capacities, your means, there's a role for you to play. Find it. Ask yourself, how can I apply my talents, my power? What can I bring to bear to help solve this problem? And start today as a climate realist. Stephen Schneider taught us that we had to fix the system. And fixing the system starts with me and you. Thank you.
Whew. Okay. So a presentation like that can leave you with a sense of helplessness and hopelessness because of the reality that he shared. But I want to remind you what he said. Not only did he say we are all involved in the problem, we're also all involved in, let's leave that slide up, thank you. We're also all involved in the solution. We all can do something to make a difference. So let's look again at the types of climate change deniers. I'm just curious, how many of you found yourself in one or more of these categories? You notice that the VIP deniers and the help us bystander deniers, those are certainly ones that I have found myself in. Oh yeah, this is something really important I have to do, I have to go to, and therefore it doesn't matter that I'm burning fossil fuel to do it. It's much too important to avoid or to cancel or to do something about, so I'm going to keep on doing it. And after all, I'm a pretty important person, so I can do that. It's worth it. And then the helpless bystander, well, yeah, I know this is going on, but it's so much bigger than me. I mean, what can I do about it? I can wring my hands. I can, tell people how awful it is, but there's nothing I can do. I'm just one small person. So I find myself there. How about the rest of you? Let's have just a moment. We can't take too much time, but just a moment. Who else finds themselves in one of these categories? You have to unmute yourself and talk.
Well, maybe not a denier, but I used to do consulting, and that had to be on site. And it was, a wagon train wouldn't get me there. So it was a necessity, and I did worry about it because I knew that even 20 years ago I knew that flying was not a benign way of getting there, but I saw no other ways to do it, especially since those were the days before Zoom and before the ability to collect data remotely.
Right.
And so I think some of that, I'm not sure we would call ourselves deniers, but we would say we still do it and we agonize about it.
Yeah, we justify it.
Yeah, or even if we don't see another way.
Yeah, so VIP justifiers maybe.
Yeah, or
Hey.
yeah, or just what's the other option?
Right.
Well, the option was to not take a trip to see our children because it's an extra 5 days if we drive, and we didn't want to fly because that just seemed like it was fraught with many things, including it not being the best choice. So, there's an offset.
Yeah, so relationships are important too. And so we juggle relationships versus the climate crisis, don't we?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay. Joan, I'm going to put you on the spot. Could you just share what you shared with the climate team about your carbon budget?
Well, then I'd have to remember. But but this, I've watched, this is now the third time I've watched this TED video, and the second time it really hit me that my lifestyle is simply not sustainable. And that on a global scale, my lifestyle is simply not equitable. And that I'm part of the problem, not part of the solution, because I still think it's important for me to go to World Conference. It's important for me to go to Focus Week at some seminary. It's important for me to do this. It's important for me to do that. And it really hit me that I simply can't anymore. And so it was like drawing a line in the sand for me. I sat down, did the carbon footprint calculator stuff, found out what our carbon footprint is, working on ways to reduce all of our carbon footprint. But I just made the decision that transportation is a big part, and I just simply have to cut it in half. So that doesn't mean I won't fly anywhere ever. It doesn't mean I won't drive anywhere ever. But, starting today, I have to cut my transportation carbon emissions in half. And, I may not get quite there this year, but the goal is to reduce everything by 50% by 2030. And I can do that, provided I start today. Can I just also mention that the technology deniers, I think our whole society is primarily there, in that the politicians are there. They don't want solutions that endanger the economy, that endanger employment, that lower the GDP. And so they're really fixed on technology solutions that maybe in 10 years from now will start to lower emissions, but are doing nothing in the next 3 to 5 years to lower emissions. And I'm not sure we have that time.
Thank you, Joan. Okay, anybody else?
I think for me, I don't like to say that I'm a denier, but when he said, have I been living the life of a climate change denier? That was like, oh, that's a really good point. Like, really, how am I living any differently than someone who is the climate crisis science denier, that traditional sense that we use it. So I see myself in the helpless bystander and the like, well, it's my life. Like, it's my job. I have to drive to my job. Like, that's where I'm finding myself.
Tiffany, I appreciate that. I think a lot of us, I won't say all of us because I can't speak for all of you, but a lot of us are the helpless bystander deniers, the ones that are living a lifestyle that is more the lifestyle of a climate science denier than it is someone who truly understands the reality and is making changes. Yeah, I'm there. Trying, but waking up. Yeah. Okay, I hate to cut this off, but we need to move on. Let's take a few minutes to think about Peter's denial of Jesus and our denial of the current climate crisis. What are the similarities and what are the differences between the predicament he found himself in and the predicament that we find ourselves in? What are the similarities and what are the differences? Again, we'll just take a few moments. What do you see as similar and different in these parallel situations? Are they more similar or more different? What do you think?
We can look at fear for starters. Peter's fear was really about his own physical danger, immediate and visible and sensed in the people around him. It's different with climate denial. Our fears are much more vague and oriented towards what possibly might happen. And those are more easy to suppress. On the one hand, if we're talking about we need to make a change, and it's also easier to dismiss the threat of our future because it isn't immediate and apparent.
That's right, Charlie. It is a psychological truth that incremental changes that lead to disaster can easily be ignored, whereas immediate emergency events that lead to disaster cannot be ignored and have to be faced and coped with. And climate crisis is an incremental emergency. Okay, what else is the same or different? Fear, of course, is a factor in both, but I think what you've said, Charlie, is very true about the nature of that fear.
I think we said earlier that part of Peter's issue was he was kind of lost without guess an anchor or an understanding of where things go now. I think the same thing can happen with climate change. How does my life change? What's it going to look like?
Mhm.
And am I willing to go there? From my perspective, sometimes you get forced into it. The pandemic forced my wife and I to consolidate trips and not just wake up and say, oh, I need to go to the store. It caused us to actually question and say, do you really need that? but it still changes your life. And the question is, are you willing to accept that change without knowing totally what that's going to look like?
That's right. Well said. Anybody else?
I discovered something today. I've been trying to figure out ways that I could cut down on my driving around town. So today I had to go uptown and I decided to walk. I realized before I got there that I had overdone and I didn't know if I was going to make it home. And I realized that right now where I am physically, I can't do the walking as far as I would like to go. And even though I'm in a small town, most places are not within walking distance for me.
Mhm.
And that, so I'm going to figure out some way to cut back on what I do.
Okay, so there's a re-evaluation, a reassessment of options that Peter faced and that you faced too. Okay.
Can I just jump in and say, we're missing the charismatic leader. We don't have the charismatic leader who has it all figured out. We've got scientists who are telling us this is what we need to do, but scientists are terrible at PR and marketing and spin. And we've got politicians and corporations telling us, oh no, you don't need to do all that, with a lot of spin and PR and marketing. And it makes it very confusing.
Yeah, and Peter was alone among those who did not believe what he was saying and did not understand his truth and reality. And climate change activists are quite often also isolated in a culture that doesn't want to change, doesn't want to make any differences in their lifestyle or their consumption or things like that. So there's a similarity there, even though there's difference in the emergencies that they face.
I wonder a little bit in the climate conversation if the part of the problem isn't that we talk about everything we have to give up, and we never talk about what doing that would mean. What would the world look like if we actually did what we talk about and address the crisis? We talk and tell everybody, well, you can't drive as much, or you can't have your pickup, or you can't have, and so everything is kind of a takeaway, and we don't spend a lot of time addressing the here's the reason to do it, because here's the goal, and here's what life will look like if we make those changes.
That's right, Murray. We focus on what I would have to give up, what I'd have to sacrifice. And like Peter, we might find ourselves saying, well, I could sacrifice all this, but what difference is it going to make? If I acknowledge that I'm a follower of Jesus and end up dying as a result, what difference is it going to make? If I give up my my consumption and my energy gas guzzling vehicle, what difference is it really going to make? It's one little drop in the ocean. One of our team members is Lori Gordon, who is very focused on spiritual formation. And she reminded us that one of the spiritual practices that has been in existence for centuries is the practice of simplicity. And in the Christian practice of simplicity, there is not a focus on sacrifice and giving up. The focus is on gratitude. And so you begin with acknowledging what you have already and the gratitude you have for all the things of life that you already possess, that already support your life, that you already own. And then out of gratitude, you choose to make that enough. What I have is enough. I don't need more. Thank you, God. This is enough. And others who don't have as much can be blessed by my not using more. So the focus becomes not what we give up, but what we already have that is sufficient instead of always wanting more. So I just thought I'd share that perspective. It may not be a complete solution, but it is a beginning, Murray, I think, for that sense of loss and sacrifice and being drugged, kicking and screaming into a new lifestyle.
I appreciate that, because I think that's a better conversation than saying, okay, no, you can't do this and you can't do that, and it's rather than looking at it as a blessing and that you already are enough without all these things. So I appreciate that.
Right. Yeah. One of the other things, Peter and we both face living our lives in a system that is powerful, overwhelming, and not wanting to change. And of course, that's why Jesus died, because he threatened a system that did not want to change, did not want to hear about the kingdom. And we also live in a powerful, overwhelming system that doesn't want to change. Just want to point out a difference before we leave this and go on with some of our other conversation. One of the differences is that in Peter's day, folks like Peter were among the oppressed. They were among the poor that were struggling to survive and struggling to find a new way. Because we are in a Western wealthy civilization, we can't say that we are among the oppressed. We are among those who've contributed massively to this situation. We could even be called the oppressors when it comes to adding fossil fuels emissions into the atmosphere that impact those who are less fortunate than ourselves. So that's another major difference between Peter's day and our day, is our role in it, which again, should, I hope, motivate us to be grateful for what we have and let it be enough. And then move from there to thinking about how we can live with even less so that others may live with more. All right, let's take, I think it's about time for a break. Let's take a 4-minute break and come back at 2 o'clock. Can you do that? So you can turn off your videos, turn off your audio if you want, and come back at 2 o'clock, and let's move on to a different conversation about what can be done, and then hope. See you in a few minutes.
Susan and Chris, I'm not sure if Chris is still there. The PowerPoint is not on slideshow, and so we're still seeing the list of slides to the left. I'm not sure who's controlling the PowerPoint.
Chris had mentioned that she would like to do it that way because it was easier for her, but
Oh, okay.
I can just
Okay,
then I can
that's
just click to the next one, but I've been having visual issues on my end, so I apologize, because when I first turned it on, like, I couldn't see anybody, like everybody disappeared, and all I was seeing was a PowerPoint, and so I worked myself through that, and so anyway, so I apologize. I probably, when I restarted, I could put it in the full screen mode, but.
No, it's all right. If it's easy for you, leave it that way. I just wasn't sure, if somebody had forgotten, but that's fine.
Is this
It's
a
working.
form of technological denial?
Yeah.
It is,
Exactly.
because normally I I have less experience doing this because I let Matt do it all the way usually. So
Well, because we're seeing at least I am seeing a couple gray bars
Okay,
that are
that's good
overlapping
to,
and that probably is because you have a program open behind the PowerPoint that you're sharing.
okay,
So sometimes that bleeds through. Serena did a workshop or did a service where all of a sudden words started coming through her PowerPoint, and we realized that she was doing it on a single screen, and she had a screen open behind the PowerPoint rather than minimizing it. And so I think you're trying to keep our pictures up so you can run the Zoom, and the
right.
PowerPoint, some of that's bleeding through the PowerPoint.
Hmm. So how would I fix that?
Um, are you doing it on your laptop?
I am doing it on my laptop, and I just screen share, and
You might,
I don't know
yeah, you
why.
might
When
take your picture, like your Zoom, and pull it over to the right-hand side screen and anchor it there, and then your PowerPoint to the other one, to the other side.
okay,
It's not a big deal. It hasn't affected, but I think that's what you're getting because you're doing it on a single screen that's bleeding through.
okay. I mean, I've now closed down my extra program, so we'll see. I was worried about that, seeing the bars. So
Yeah, I think it's just that you're trying to still be able to see us all on the screen. And
it's
so
very
that you have to have that program open to see Zoom and to share, and they're just running a little bit in conflict, but it's not a big deal.
all right. Well,
And I was going to tell her I couldn't be here at 2:00 our time.
Neither could I. It's 4 o'clock our time.
Or yeah, 2:00 came and went. So I gotta get a drink.
Okay, it's actually 2:01, but I see a few people are not with us yet. That's okay. That was a little bit of a ideal, I think, when I said be back by 2. That's all right.
We were just commenting that we're not, if we're way past 2:00 here.
Oh my gosh, that's right. 2 is my time. It would have been 4 your time.
Yeah, and that's okay.
Okay, well, you're right. I was not translating that.
We
And
knew
for
it.
Joan, it's 5:00. Yeah. I should have simply said be back on the hour,
There you go.
but that still would have been really pushing people to get back in minutes. I understand that.
Thank God for time zones, though. Can you imagine how it used to be? Go out and look at the sun and figure out how that coordinates across 1,200 miles.
Yes. I understand from the Sacramento Railroad Museum that it was the railroads who initiated time zone schedules and set time zones in order to coordinate train departures and arrivals. And I thought that was interesting that it was the railroads who first started implementing time zones, and it caught on and became to do.
Makes a
Before-
lot of
Trivia there.
Before
sense.
that, it was farming, and farming was run by the sun. So the railroads pushed the manufacturing to the forefront and began the process of diminishing the importance of farming.
Ah, that's another interesting side comment. Thank you, Charlie.
And they still farm by the sun to a great deal.
Mhm.
All right. Are we ready to get started? Oh, see if I can get the PowerPoint up at least. Let's see what's going on. All right. And we are down. This will be our.
Okay, so we're going to start back into our class here with a focus on community, our community-oriented roots. When you look at, again, the first century church and the fellowship of believers, you have a sense of what it meant to them to be a community. And it has been upheld in our understanding of what the kingdom of God is and what Zion is like and what our vision of Zion is like. So let me read to you from Acts 2, 42 to 47, a very familiar scripture that, again, is an ideal. And whether the writer of Acts, Luke, was presenting to us an idealized version of that fellowship of believers or an actual fact, doesn't so much matter as what he was trying to convey by describing it in this way. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their numbers those who were being saved. Our own movement, the Restoration Movement, go on to the next slide, is built on that idea of community and communal living. That concept of Zion and the kingdom that Jesus preached and modeled and taught, becoming a reality in this day to the extent that we can manage it, even as we wait for the fullness of that kingdom to be given to us by God at some point in the future. But our job now is to create it as much as possible in this day and age. So we have that vision, the Zionic goal, that has been a very important part of our community faith journey, and it has stood against the alternate societal norms of rugged individualism, especially here in the United States. And you see that being played out in Missouri with the members of our church trying to create community and in sometimes forcing those around them, their neighbors, to acknowledge and accept and be a part of that community. And those who were not part of the church upholding rugged individualism, being afraid of community efforts. It's been a journey for us and still is a vision to create Zion. So as we look now at climate change, and we can go on now to the next slide, thank you. We need to view what we are doing and how we are behaving in terms of our enduring principles. Are we living up to the values that we profess? Are we truly being conscious of community, especially the global community, in our lifestyle, our actions, and the things that we do. So here's our enduring principles. You'll note that some of those are bold, because those are the ones that come to mind immediately when we think of addressing climate change: the sacredness of creation, worth of all persons, responsible choices, blessings of community, all point us toward dealing with climate crisis in such a way that it's not just what happens to me, but what happens to all those around the globe, and upholding the worth of all people and their ability, like ours, to enjoy the sacredness of creation and the blessings of community. Albert Einstein is well known for his, let's go on, for his scientific achievements, his incredible intelligence. This quote from him is probably not known as well, but I want to read it to you because it addresses this idea of community and sacredness of creation. Human being is a part of a whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. The human being is limited in time and space. He experiences himself, please excuse the masculine pronouns here. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Isn't that the truth? Our task must be to free ourselves from the prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Like our song, draw the circle wide. Not with us as the center and focus of that circle, but God and God's relationship to nature and others as the center. Okay. Let's move on. Consider our doctrine and covenants. Lift up your eyes and fix them on the place beyond the horizon to which you are sent. Journey in trust, sure that the great and marvelous work is for this time and for all time. So when we are feeling hopeless, when we are in despair, we lift up our eyes, and although the horizon seems to limit us, we look beyond the horizon, something we cannot see yet, future held only in God's hands, and which we trust will continue to be held in God's hands as we move forward. The speaker suggests some actions that we can take to impact our climate crisis. What do you remember in terms of what he said we can do about it? He said there were lists and there was all kinds of things. He mentioned 3. Do you remember what those are? Anybody? Take a stab. And if you're wrong, it's okay. Whatever you say is going to be right.
Oh, vote.
Vote.
Mhm.
Vote for science. Vote for, yeah. Do you remember? What were some of the others?
Call your representatives.
Call your representatives. That's right. Use your voice and your words. Well done. Okay, you've got 2 of them. What are some of the others?
Don't buy so much stuff.
Aha, you got the 3rd. Don't buy so much stuff. Consumerism. Oh my gosh. And here's a little commercial. Our team will be presenting a webinar on consumerism in September 19th. So if you haven't signed up for our webinars, you can find it on our website, and we will be doing a website on consumerism. And no, we did not pay the scientist on the TED Talk to say that, so that I could insert my little commercial. All right, let's go on to the next slide. It just confirms what you said. Our climate, well, the next one after that, but a radical emergency requires radical changes in our unsustainable current lifestyles. because we have enough, not because we have to sacrifice, because we have enough. Economic transitions that protect livelihoods. And that's important that we have that balance, that we don't just destroy livelihoods as we shift economically. Moving beyond our fears of the future with a change of heart. Facing the fears and going beyond fear to radical hope. These reality and hopes anyway. And then a collective action for the good of all. So now let's go to the next slide, which affirms all of those answers you've already given. Vote for science, vote for clean energy, vote for climate change supporters and policies. Now, in October, we're going to have somebody talking to us about climate change policies. Policies 101, the very basics of what a good climate change policy looks like and what we need to be doing about it. Second, talk about the issue, push elected officials to take action, especially local ones. A lot of what happens locally with codes and regulations, stuff like that, transportation. Don't buy so much stuff and buy from sustainable producers and sellers. You know, people who've made a vow to go for a year without buying anything that they did not consume immediately. In other words, they would buy food and, you know, stuff like that. But in terms of clothes, in terms of goods, they decided not to buy anything for a year. And it was tough for them to do that. I know some who succeeded. I've not met that challenge yet. Just want you to know. But I've heard of people who did. Okay, next. So we have individual rights and we have the community good. How do we negotiate the boundary between those, given the impending climate catastrophe for humans and other life on Earth? How do we manage that boundary? And that is one of the big key questions. How do we manage that? Let's have a discussion about that.
Remembering the worth of all people.
Okay.
Respect in what we say and how we say it.
Excellent. Okay, so some of the answers go right back to our enduring principles. Remember the worth of all persons. What we do and what we say makes a difference. Okay, what else?
Well, some of these are policy issues at a local and state level. For example, in many communities right now, you cannot put solar panels on your roof. And in many homeowners associations, you can't. You cannot use solar panels. And so that's stuff that needs some advocacy and some changes of policy so that in addition to the individual right to put a solar panel on your roof, you're not damaging somebody else's right to not put a solar panel on their roof. But that's going to require some negotiation at a public level.
Absolutely. You've expressed that very well, Charlie. Yeah. And as far as advocacy goes on policy, I will just mention that recently I have joined, for the first time in my life, a political caucus with the 34th district here in Seattle that is focused on environmental land and energy use. And we are now a voice advocating for climate policies. And I have written letters, I've made phone calls, I've attended webinars that, where our representatives to Congress have spoken to us. I never thought I'd be doing that because that didn't seem to be who I am, but I am now. And I'm learning a lot. I don't know always what I'm doing, but I'm learning a lot. Okay, what else can we do? How do we negotiate that difference, individual and community?
I guess this, I think, is a big issue for us right now with regard to climate and other issues. And I think for me, the loudest voices seem to be having the most influence. So it does get back to voting and your local, get involved locally and do what you can. But there is a real, I mean, the soft, let me say, reasonable voice is easy to ignore. And so I guess the big issue is, how do you keep relationships going where our worldviews are so disparate? And I want to think that the answer is in our faith and what we know. And I think it's a struggle that we have to be prepared to face, is not going to be resolved quickly, maybe not in my lifetime, but I feel that I'm in this for my children and my grandchildren.
Right.
And I can't give up. But there is a balancing out of how much, well, I don't know, I'm not saying this well, how much do you put the value on keeping this relationship if you or I only am the one who's willing to not to silence my voice, to not buck the, what sometimes looks like the wave that's going on.
That's very true. We sometimes stand alone, and sometimes it is our small, quiet voice standing alone against strident other voices that seem to drown us out. So I think that's a really good point, Judy. And yet, I just want to remind you that politicians tell us that for every letter they receive that is a reasonable, thoughtful letter,
Mm-hmm.
they multiply it by 1,000 because they assume that there are 1,000 other people who feel the same way but do not have the courage to write.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that may not be true of the internet surveys that you assign your name to, because a lot of people will do that when they won't write a letter. And so I do both. I sign the surveys, but I also send a personal letter because I know that I speak then for about 1,000 voices.
I'm
So
glad. Mm-hmm.
never doubt that your voice can make a difference. And if they get one letter, they think it's interesting. If they get two, this is what I've heard. If they get two, then they sit up and take notice. If they get three, then they begin to discuss whether it's important enough to take action. Now, that's what I've been told. I don't know if those figures are accurate, but that's what I've been told. And if it's the 1, 2, 3 is not quite accurate, it still means that a cumulative effort of a few voices can make a big difference.
I think that depends on the representative. We have some examples locally of people that did not care how many people wrote in and told them that they needed to change. They were bound and determined to stay the course.
So there's that too. And that gets back to the voting.
That's what we did.
Voting in.
I was going to say, I am a letter writer, so I do that, but sometimes you feel like it's one little drop out there, and sometimes you don't even get an answer, but it is something. It's something. And this I just think is the question for our time. How are we going to balance that boundary between individual rights and community good? And I wish I
Right.
had.
Well, I think for me, as I thought about this a little bit more, is I have to see myself as part of the community,
Mhm.
because it's not me against them, it's us in the boat together. And sometimes I think for whatever reason we can get into us against them rather than seeing the importance of I'm part of the community. So how do I help my neighbor? How do I, we talk about consumerism. We have a young lady that moved in next door and wanted to do some work and was talking about buying tools. And we said, don't buy tools, we have them, and so how do we help our neighbors? How do we take responsibility to be a good neighbor rather than um, uh, accentuating our rights and saying, no, no, it's about me. And that's hard in today's world, because there is that, I want to drive my pickup, or I want to do this, or I want to do that, as opposed to, wait a minute, how does that impact my
Right.
neighbors and my larger community?
Mhm.
So I think that would be helpful. You can't always get people to see that, but the discussion has to be about how do your actions affect the community as a whole?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
really,
that's right. And seeing yourself as integrally involved in the community, not separate from it.
Yeah.
Really important, Murray. Thank you. Yes.
I'm thinking about something that's often an answer, but I don't mean to be trite, but I think that it's about relationship. When we do what Murray referenced, in relationship with someone that we are intentionally connecting with, we're not living in isolation, then I think we have a greater chance of one by one making some kind of difference that has a ripple effect. And we're living an example with that person when we have those conversations.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think sometimes in our neighborhoods or in our workplaces, we can have a big impact too. Dewey and I used to live in a neighborhood where we actually decided that we didn't want all these garbage trucks coming into the neighborhood. And so we negotiated with one to pick up everybody's, and it meant a lot less coming and going.
Well done.
We currently live in a townhome complex, and where we make a lot of choices that affect energy. I'm on the board here, and so we do have to look at a lot of different things that affect energy. I find it sometimes difficult to, I might be more conscious of the energy issues. And so education, I need to keep myself educated, but I need to help in a gentle way to educate other people too, so that we can, I know they're just little things, but they add up.
Yes, they do. And education is extremely important. That's one of the goals of our climate justice team, is to help educate people about what's going on and what can be done about it. Okay, any last comments before we move into the closing elements?
Can I just say, it doesn't always have to be either or. We can look for the win-win that's good for the individuals and for the community good.
Thank you, Joan, for that reminder. Yes, of course. Again, it gets back to Murray's statement that we are part of the community. We aren't separate from it. And we can all win.
I think, and I really believe that. I really do. My frustration is that the loudest voices in the country right now is emphasizing one over the other, individual rights over community good. And I'm an educator of over 40 years, so I really believe in education, but I think what Penn said, I think is trying to keep the relationship going and being intact is a thin line that you walk sometimes, where in order to do that, you can't be for a cause. You just have to be for that person and hope. And what that means for me personally is that I may not see a movement. Please God, let my children and grandchildren, that those incremental steps that we take, if we do have that kind of time, that we can take that approach, knowing that we're going to be facing loud daily voices emphasizing my right is more important than the collective good of the community. And I don't think there's a simple answer other than maybe just what we've said. Keep the relationships growing, respect the people, recognizing you won't see immediate change.
One thing that just occurred to me is maybe we also need to write to our television networks and our media outlets and say, can we hear other voices? Because the voices that we are hearing, you're absolutely right. We hear about individual rights, but I suspect, at least in my circle of people, those aren't as important as community is, but that's not the voice that the media is allowing to be heard. And so maybe we also need to write to our local television and say, we need more voices, different voices, all the voices rather than just certain segments.
That's right, Murray. Write to your TV and media, write to your insurance companies, write to corporations, write to politicians, write to government offices that deal with codes and regulations. There's a lot that can be done by writing, even if your voice cannot be heard in personal relationships. So I just want to stress that. I'm sorry, but we do need to close, and I would like to close with a poem. This will be a poem of hope and vision, a poem of benediction. It is a poem that was given to us by a street poet in the midst of our planning of these webinars at a time when we were beginning to struggle a little bit with what felt like hopelessness and helplessness. And out of God's grace and goodness and inspiration came this street poet who offered us this poem, Bridge of Hope by Karen Kunkel. When we come to the abyss, snakes, fire, midnight hole, nightmares, whatever, down below, we know we must sing the old refrain of hope. It is only by singing out we are heard. It is the raising of the voice that changes the singer. We must be brave enough to be changed, for in the speaking we are changed. In the trying to name, we are discovered. It is the taking of the step that calls. It is the taking of the step that calls the earth to rise to meet it. What needs to be found can only be built stone by stone, pebble by pebble, hope by hope, word by word. Many speakers, many singers, many builders, waiting to be told what to do, but what is needed has never been done before. We all must be the blind leaders in the dark, mouths dry and singing prayers off key, our hands full of dust, and pebbles and our grandmother's seeds. Be the mad woman leading the way. Trust your love and trust this path will change you. Trust others will join you. The only way off the crumbling cliff is to build this bridge. As you go every day to the edge of what you know of yourself, and then go beyond. There you will find others singing a familiar song, becoming a new way together. There will be no name for this new place until long after we are gone. But you feel it calling, praying you into being. Go fly. Do it now. I will join you. Thank you all for being here, for taking your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Our website is Sea of Christ climatejustice.org. All one word, all lowercase, all run together. Sea of Christ climatejustice.org.
All right.
You can see our past webinars and conversations. You can sign up for the new ones that are coming up in the fall. We have an art piece that you can purchase. The poem I just read is there for your enjoyment. So visit us. Spread the word. Be a voice. Go fly. Do it now. I will join you.
Amen and amen.
Thank you.
Grace
Thank
and
you.
peace, y'all.
Thank you, Susan and Joan.